Welcome back, Gadgeteers. Today we're going to talk about the Yoga 920 and how it's working with Linux. So I bought this laptop back in February of 2018 to replace my Yoga 910, and I haven't had a chance to do an official review, so without further ado, here we go. So I've got the Yoga 920. The model I purchased is the 4K ultra high definition screen with 16 gigabytes of DDR4 2400 megahertz memory. It has a very fast 512 gigabyte SSD, and it comes in the platinum all aluminum chassis. Now, it's interesting about the chassis because it's actually kind of a halfway point between the space gray of the new MacBook and the old silver chassis that they had in the Yoga 910, which I actually like the silver quite a bit. So whenever I do pick up a MacBook, I usually get the silver chassis, and in this case I would have preferred the silver chassis just like the Yoga 910. But now they've got this platinum silver, they call it. But in reality, it's halfway between space gray. Now, one interesting thing about the keyboard on the chassis is instead of the black keys with white text, which I actually did like, this particular unit has gray keys. They're a darker gray with a lighter gray stenciling on the keys themselves. As far as the keyboard goes with typability, it's actually excellent. I find it very, very easy to use. If you've used pretty much any chiclet keyboard in the last several years, you will find this one very nice and easy to get along with. One of the major changes they made on the keyboard, which you've probably already heard about, is they now have a full-size right-hand shift key, which makes things much easier when you're typing. I actually am a touch typist. I learned when I was really young, so when I type, I really prefer to be able to type and hit that shift key without having to worry about moving my pinky over. Although with my Yoga 910 and the shorter shift key, I was able to train my hand to move over whenever I had to use the shift key. Again, the chassis is all aluminum. It's beautiful. I love the way it looks. I did buy a hard case for it like I do with all my systems to protect that look and keep it as beautiful as it was when it was brand new. On the outside of the chassis, just like the Yoga 910, it's got that watch band hinge. I really don't care either way, whether it was the standard two-ended hinges that were on the typical laptops or like on the Yoga 910, the watch band hinge. On the outside of the computer, there are two USB-C ports on the left-hand side. Those are Thunderbolt 3. And they also are used to power the device as well. So you can plug into either port now, where before with the Yoga 910, you could only plug in with the USB-C port closest to the edge of the computer. On the right-hand side of the computer is a USB Type A port, which I really, really like. I use it all the time to plug in external hard drives or an external USB mouse, which is really nice. And of course, the big one when I'm transferring documents or video files back and forth, I can quickly just punch in a USB thumb drive and I'm good to go. I don't have to look for a dongle, which is very nice. I found out that unlike the Yoga 910, which has a pronounced external Novo button, and for those of you who don't know, the Novo button is used to boot the computer up into the BIOS so that you can get easy access to any of the changes you might have to make in the BIOS. Now, the Yoga 920, instead of a button, actually has a hole, and it might be misleading and make you think that it's a reset switch, but it's actually not. So if you put a paper clip or some small object like the head of a pen in there, you can actually boot the computer up into the BIOS right away so you can make easy changes. A full 8 months before Apple decided to put the Coffee Lake processors into their MacBook Pro lineup, the Yoga 920 actually already had Coffee Lake with the i7-8550 in the case of this particular system. Now that does give us 4 cores, and it works great for video editing. I found that over the Yoga 910 I see a performance increase of about 200%. So when I'm rendering videos, it's about twice as fast in Linux, which really works out great for me. For those of you who don't believe the 4K screen won't make a difference in comparison to a MacBook Pro, you absolutely have to see this computer side by side with a MacBook Pro. The difference is palpable. You can see it, and it to me is much easier on the eyes. So I really like that 4K screen, and I think it's well worth the money. Now the MacBook Pro i9 and to some extent the i7 has come under controversy for overheating, and I did go ahead and test the Yoga 920 in Windows, and what I did was run programs like Cinebench R15 and Prime 95 to see if indeed we did get any type of thermal throttling. So the i7-8550 processor can boost up to 4 gigahertz, and I definitely saw using Prime 95 some throttling taking place. So initially it did boost up there to almost 4 gigahertz, and it stayed up there for maybe 10 to 15 seconds, and then of course it throttled down. Now the base clock speed on my model I believe is 2 gigahertz. I'll have a video here that I'm running that you can check out, and after a few minutes of course it went down from that boosting speed of 4 gigahertz quite a bit. But it was able to stay above the base clock speed, which is actually a good thing. But the point being, all of these ultra portable laptops are going to have some throttling, and that's just the way it is. So there's really no surprise that the MacBook Pro with the i9 and 6 cores is actually seeing throttling. Despite that throttling, getting over twice the speed in video editing and rendering out video files is definitely good, even with the throttling. Now on the underside of the chassis are the speakers, and these are JBL speakers. The sound is decent. I would have to say it's slightly better than the Yoga 910, but not really by much. It's not like you should run out and buy the Yoga 920 if you already have the 910 just for the speakers, so consider that factor. My opinion is when you compare them to a MacBook, even the base 12-inch MacBook, they're just night and day. The speakers are decent, but there's no bass or low end on them. Well, actually there is, but it's more mid-range, so there's just no comparison. They're good enough, but you're probably going to want to use headphones most of the time. So surprisingly, this unit did have some problems with dongles. I bought this ANPOW dongle, which has on it a USB-A port, a USB-C powered port, so you can actually power your unit through that port and charge it if you need to, and a full HDMI. Now, what doesn't work on this ANPOW USB-C dongle is the HDMI port, and that's the primary reason that I bought it. So I went out and replaced it with a unit that is actually more like space gray called the Beeasy. Now, this Beeasy has on the very end of it an HDMI port, and then what I think is really nice, and I have had a chance to use, are the memory slots here. So we have a full size, and then we have the micro SD card slot, and that slot has come in really handy for me when I transfer video files from one of my cameras. Over here we have 2 USB-A ports. Now all of these ports work, and the HDMI actually works with the Yoga 920 just fine, and it powered my 4K TV as well as the laptop in 4K at the same time, and it's very useful when I'm editing so that I can move other objects to my additional screen. Just speeds things up nicely. I also wanted to point out that the dongle testing I did in both Windows and Fedora 28 Linux, and it didn't matter which operating system I was in. The ANPOW dongle did not work for HDMI, but it did work with the USB-A and C ports. Just keep that in mind. The other thing that I did is buy a USB-C straight to full-size HDMI, and that worked perfectly fine, but I did notice it worked on the inside port more than it did on the outside port, so your mileage may vary. The Yoga 910 had no problem whatsoever using any dongles or anything plugged into it. So apparently the controller has changed for USB, and that makes sense because I'm sure they were hoping it would be faster, and it's Thunderbolt, but unfortunately it's introduced a few problems. But if you do buy the Beeasy USB-C dongle, I think you'll be fine, and I'll leave the link down below in the description. The Fedora 28 installation went off without even the slightest problem. Prior to my installation of Fedora 28, I did go into Windows and shrink the Windows partition. The other thing that I did is turn off BitLocker. This is important if you want to access your NTFS Windows partition from Linux, so you do have to disable BitLocker. Now, just so you know, it does take quite a bit of time to disable BitLocker on that Windows partition, so expect to wait probably up to 45 minutes, believe it or not. At this point, I've only tested battery life in Linux, and I'm getting about 6 hours of battery life. Now, just to qualify what I do when I'm using my laptop on battery, I do not spare the battery. So I'm not setting the brightness at 40% and doing light casual browsing. I use it for everything I want to do with the exception of rendering video files. So I may be doing video editing, text editing, watching videos, all of the things that I like to do, browse the internet, and the brightness is typically for me set to about 80%. So that's been the sweet spot for me when I'm inside, 70 to 80%. As the night goes on and if I dim the lights, I can take down the brightness, but the device definitely works great for me. 6 hours is more than good enough. If I wanted to, I could definitely cut the brightness way down and limit what type of use that I'm doing, but I don't. So just so you know, I'm actually more of a heavy user when I'm on the battery, and I wanted to test that to see what it can really do. They're saying these units can run 10 hours if it's the Ultra HD screen, and something like 15 hours if you get the HD screen on it. And quite frankly, I want to have pleasurable use of my system. I don't need 15 hours where you can barely see the screen and you can't take it outside. So that doesn't make any sense to me. The only thing I never do on the battery is rendering, because of course it would definitely tap the battery heavily. I did try it once and I found that the drain on the battery is significant, and it's the same with a MacBook Pro. So rendering is out. So how did it go getting Fedora 28 set up on this system? Well, in actuality, I started with Fedora 27 and everything actually worked perfectly fine. I started experiencing problems when I moved to Fedora 28. A couple of the problems that I had was the USB cutting out. It literally, something with the driver with USB would simply fail and all the USB ports would go dead. At the same time as the USB ports going dead, Bluetooth would also go dead. This never happened, of course, in Windows 10, so I did have a comparison and I knew that it shouldn't be happening. What actually fixed it ultimately was updates from Fedora for Fedora 28, and within, I would say, about a week, all of the irritable issues and problems that I was having with the system evaporated. I thought initially that the dongle was actually a software issue, but I quickly discovered by using Windows that it wasn't, and I purchased a new dongle, which was very inexpensive, and it works perfectly fine. The one problem that I'm still experiencing with Fedora 28 is every once in a while, I would say maybe 1 out of every 4 times, when I close the screen and put the unit to sleep and then open the screen back up, the mouse pad won't work, the touchpad. So what I end up having to do, it's really simple. I just close the screen again and open the screen back up, and I'll actually see an display come up that says touchpad on. So at that point, I know the touchpad's working fine. It's not really a big deal. It only takes an extra 5 seconds if the problem does occur. So you may experience that. Now, not only have I installed Fedora 28 on this laptop, but I actually did run Linux Mint for a little while, version 18, just so you know, on the laptop. And I'm a heavy KDE Plasma desktop user because, of course, I'm editing, and I use the Kdenlive editor, which in my personal opinion looks best when you're working in KDE. You certainly can use it in other desktop environments, but my personal experience is that it looks best in KDE. If you buy the 4K edition of this laptop, you are absolutely going to want to install KDE Plasma and try it out. As far as scaling goes, KDE Plasma as a desktop environment does the best job. I found that GNOME is only passing and you can get by so-so. You can change the resolution to 1920 by 1080, and I hear many of you say, well, just change the resolution, but it actually makes that screen much less sharp and much less clear, which is really something that to me is a bummer. Unfortunately, with KDE Plasma, you do have to manually set up scaling on your own. It doesn't automatically scale like Windows 10 does, and it doesn't even make it an attempt. I'm hoping in the future that KDE Plasma will be able to scale by itself, but the scaling is really good. It scales applications as well, so unlike GNOME, when you open the browser and you have a very, very small, tiny text inside the browser, even though the widgets and the browser itself and the menu bar at the top are all correct, the text in the browser itself is tiny, and you usually have to zoom it up to like 200–250%. Contrast that with KDE Plasma, where once you have scaling set, it does scale applications as well. Just so you know, some applications don't scale depending on whether they're GTK or not, so your mileage may vary. One of those applications that does not scale well still after all these years is GIMP. I have to say, one of the big problems with Linux still is 4K resolution and scaling. It's as if Linux doesn't even want to admit, and when I say Linux, I'm lumping together not just the operating systems, but the applications as well. They are so far behind the curve on 4K resolution and scaling, it's ridiculous. When you look at Mac OS, and I realize they're not 4K, but they are a higher resolution than HD, it looks perfect. If you run Linux in HD at 1920 by 1080p, everything looks fine. So basically, 99% of the development still with applications and the operating system are going towards standard HD definition instead of Ultra HD and 4K. And that's a big disappointment for me. Luckily, KDE Plasma does let you make changes to at least scale your desktop so that you can still use it in 4K, and it does a great job. I would say 95% of the applications still work great. You can get an example of the problems if you download a compressed file and you right-click it and say you want to extract. What happens is initially, of course, you're looking at that particular file in Dolphin, which is the file manager of KDE Plasma, and when you right-click it and say you want to extract, instead of actually extracting, what it does is opens up Nautilus, which is the GNOME file manager. And of course, it looks very awkward and the text is difficult to read and much smaller. Theoretically, if you were to download the Fedora 28 KDE Spin specifically, this would not be a problem. For those of you who don't know, I always download the Fedora 28 GNOME Spin, and then I usually install KDE myself because I like to have both of them. You may want to try just the Fedora 28 KDE Plasma Spin if you do get the 4K high-resolution screen. Overall, I think KDE Plasma is a beautiful work experience, if a little bit more conventional than GNOME. Of course, if you want a Windows-like interface, you're going to find that KDE is much, much easier to use. If you want something that's a little bit more progressive and newer, and theoretically you could use in tablet mode, you would want to use the GNOME interface. In my personal experience, the only thing that I think still looks very, very unattractive are the right-click menus in KDE Plasma. It's like they never tried to change it. It is the most basic, awkward looking text I've ever seen in a right-click menu. It doesn't compare. No other operating system makes a right-click menu look so poor. I should say no other desktop environment. So there are other desktop environments you can try out there, so give a couple other ones a look and see what you think. Application-wise, Fedora 28 is just like any other Linux distro. There are several applications out there you can use. Because I do YouTube videos, my favorite apps that I use all the time are OBS, GovCView, Kdenlive, GIMP, the console, LibreOffice, and to some extent for gaming, I use Steam and DOSBox, and Handbrake and VLC. There's a ton of applications available out there for just about any area that you want to work in. I hear many Mac users and Windows PC users complain that the applications don't compare or the games don't compare. I really think that's simply not true. It just depends on whether or not you want to learn how to use the applications. Kdenlive is a video editor that I've used quite extensively, is more than capable and easily on par with Adobe Premiere. I won't say that it has as good render times as Adobe Premiere because that wouldn't be true, but as far as utility and functionality, it's wonderful and you don't have to pay that monthly fee, and I think that's a major bonus. The overall look and experience of Fedora 28 and Linux in general is actually very nice, very polished. With all of my systems running Fedora 28 and my experiences running Linux Mint and to some small extent, but not lately, Ubuntu, I don't have very many problems. There are the occasional problems when I'm doing testing or I'm trying something on my system and I actually am responsible for provoking a problem. But overall, my experience is excellent with Fedora. I am able to guarantee that when I need to boot my system up and get to work, I know it's just going to work. I have everything set up the way I want. That's what I need in an operating system. I did release a video called One Small Problem with the Yoga 28, and of course I was referencing the AMPOW USB-C dongle here not working correctly, and just by getting a different dongle the problem was fixed. Now what the user said was, well, I'm just going to use Mac OS and continue buying Macs because that way I don't have any problems. I don't know if you watch Louis Rossmann at all, but with the new MacBook Pros, Louis Rossmann had several problems with generic or third-party dongles that he wasn't having when he used the $80 dongle that you can buy from Apple. And this is much the same thing. So it's not like if you go to the MacBook Pro and you pay $27.99 for a really nice MacBook Pro 15-inch, which is comparable to this unit, because this unit actually, although it's smaller, it doesn't have a 13-inch screen. It actually has a 14-inch diagonal screen, so it's slightly larger. It's like in between the MacBook Pro 13 and 14-inch screen. If you think by buying the MacBook Pro you can get away from issues buying third-party products like dongles, you're really mistaken. It doesn't work that way. You're still going to have problems whether you're in Windows, Linux, or Mac OS. It's just the way it is. Getting back to stability, whenever I turn on my Yoga 920 or my Dell Ryzen 5675 desktop, both of which are running Fedora, or my 10-year-old AMD Phenom 2 X6, which is running Linux Mint in the other room, they simply come up and they always work. I did release a video about 2 weeks ago I wanted to update you on where I was having a problem with a timeout when trying to access the home directory on my SSD when booting up, which would cause a boot up failure. After doing an update, maybe 2 days after the fact, I never saw that problem surface again on the Yoga 920. So I don't think it's a hardware issue. It wasn't having a problem with Windows. A really quick update fixed the problem. As with many of the bugs introduced into Mac OS and iOS on a regular basis that are simply fixed by a quick update, Linux is no exception. If a problem does surface, if you just have a little bit of patience and try your updates again the next day or maybe 2 days later, usually the problem's fixed. One of the strategies that I use when doing updates is, of course, not to update both of your systems on the same day if you do indeed have two systems. That way, if you introduce a bug on one, you don't introduce it on the second one. The other thing is, I have a little bit of hardware disparity with one being an AMD and the other being an Intel-based system. So, even though I have, at times, done an update on both systems on the same day, one may see a problem surface where the other one doesn't. So it doesn't necessarily mean that because you do updates on both systems, if their hardware is different, you may not see a problem at all. So for me, I've invested the time to understand and have the ability to use Linux, and I realize that many aren't going to use Linux, but my work experience and my user experience is awesome. Now, many of you complain about the lack of games. There actually are thousands of games that are available. What you may be referring to is some specific game that you enjoy playing that you cannot play on Linux, and if it works better on Windows, why not just dual boot into Windows? Both my Dell Ryzen and my Yoga 920 are dual boot systems. I feel that if you're going to do some specific function on your computer, you're going to want to use the tool that works best. I feel like Microsoft Windows or Linux, they're just tools. You're going to use the one that works best for you. Does it mean that you have to be on Windows all the time? No. Does it mean you have to be on Linux all the time? Definitely not. But if you are interested in dual booting, you can do it without destroying your Windows installation. Just remember to disable BitLocker on your Yoga 920 before you try to resize that partition, or you will destroy the Windows installation. Otherwise, they get along perfectly fine and I have no problems. The only time I did have a problem is when I tried to install Linux Mint on a thumb drive from, of course, a bootable USB to a blank thumb drive, and unfortunately it did do that, but it did mess up the boot partition of my Fedora 28 installation. But there were many users who actually made some great comments on that video about how that problem can be fixed in the future. So if I ever do it again and I come upon that problem, now I know what to do, and thank you very much for those tips. So the bottom line is, how is the Yoga 920 on Linux, and is it something that you would want to seriously consider if you're out there looking to purchase a new laptop? The answer to that for me is absolutely yes. I think that Linux works perfectly fine on this particular laptop. There were some minor bugs, pretty much like any operating system with Fedora 28 getting started, but after a few updates, most of those problems were resolved with that one minor one I told you about with the mouse pad, aka the touchpad, which isn't a big deal. Linux is my chosen work environment, and when I'm on the road and traveling, I always take my whatever at the time is my Linux laptop, and it's usually dual bootable into Windows just in case I need to boot into Windows. There are other laptops you can consider. You can look at a System 76 or some other Linux based system. Some have said the System 76 is very, very good, and basically it was designed from the ground up with Linux in mind, so that's a major bonus. And if you like Ubuntu and Linux Mint, I think those are going to work really well, because basically System 76 laptops were designed to work with those versions of Linux. The one thing I will say community-wise and in general, the research that I got, is that the Yoga 920 and the Yoga lineup and the ThinkPad lineup are very, very, very good with Linux and very well designed and set up to support Linux. So if you're looking at a Yoga 910, I would not consider a 910. I would definitely jump to the 920, mainly because of the fact of the quad-core processing. The only exception might be if you could get the Yoga 910 on a discount and you aren't looking to do very heavy hitting things like video editing. It still works great though, the Yoga 910, don't get me mistaken. You could use it for video editing if you wanted to, but you're going to see a considerable performance boost with the Yoga 920. Well, that about wraps it up. I hope you find the video useful. If you did, do me a big favor and do a like and consider subscribing, because it definitely helps the channel out. And if you found the video useful, consider sharing it and passing it around. I always appreciate that as well. Love hearing your comments and your experiences. It does help me refine my videos, and I definitely get great tips from you, the user. I'm certainly not one of those guys who knows everything, so I always appreciate your comments. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you next time on Fast Gadgets. This video was made possible with support from viewers like you. If you find this video useful, consider becoming a patron for as little as $1 a month at patreon.com/fastgadgets.